Welcome to my series on fraction multiplication. Hopefully you've already watched and talked with your children about my Fraction Sense series, which is a 5-part series that introduces your child to fractions and understanding about how fractions operate, including equivalent fractions, adding and subtracting with uncommon denominators. So here we're going to do a 3-part series on fraction multiplication. And to begin with, it's important that your child knows repeated addition is another way of thinking about multiplication. So here we have some whole numbers just to get your child used to seeing that multiplication can be done with the little x, with the dot in the middle, and with parentheses. So make sure your child knows this before you move on with the rest of fraction multiplication. So first, it's important for your child to see patterns in multiplication. And oftentimes, the first thing a child thinks is multiplication means growth, because they're used to thinking something like 3 times 2 equals 6. And 6 is larger than both the 3 and the 2, and so somehow multiplication always means growth. But of course it doesn't. When you do that same factor of 3 and you multiply it by just 1, there's no growth, because the product of the answer is the same as the original whole number. So multiplying by 1 is giving you the same answer as the product that is not the 1. So then, by extension, a whole number times a fraction, that's actually going to decrease the product from the original whole number. So say now we have 3 times 1/2. That's 1/2 3 times, which is just 3/2, or 1.5, which is less than the original factor of 3. Now we're going to cover this in a moment. It's my firm belief that you should work with your child on whole numbers and unit fractions at first, repeatedly, to get them used to how fractions decrease the product. And here's why. So if I have 4 times 1/2, remember it's repeated addition. This is equivalent to 1/2 plus 1/2 plus 1/2 plus 1/2. So in my other videos, I go over sense making on why 1/2 plus 1/2 is 1 whole. And so here we have 1 whole twice. So the answer is 2. So 4 times 1/2 is 2. Next, we have 4 times 2/3. Well, here's 2/3. And so if I have 4 groups of 2/3, that's 4 groups of physically, literally these 2/3. So 2/3 is 2, 4, 6, 8. It equals 8/3, which is more than 1, right? Because 3/3 is 1. 3/3 is another 1. That leaves 2/3 left over. So this can convert to the mixed number 2 whole groups plus 2/3, which again, this product is less than that factor. But don't skip this step. Continually talk to your kids about why 8/3 is equivalent to 2 2/3. It is a division problem. This is 8 divided by 3, but kids should think about this as groups of 1. A group of 1 and then the leftover. 2 groups of 1 and the leftover. After doing that enough times, you start to introduce and have your child figure out the algorithm of why we multiply straight across when we just multiply fractions. So here's 3 times 2/3. 3 groups of 2/3, 2 plus 2 plus 2 is 6, so I get 6/3, which is equivalent to 2 whole units. But this is where your child can start to recognize, well, but didn't I just do 3 times 2 to get 6? And the answer is yes, but the 3 stayed the same. That should be logical because thirds is what you're working with, so you're just getting a whole bunch of thirds together. Well, you could talk about why is 3 over 1 still just 3, whereas 2/3 is a fraction less than 1. Well, this is the group size, so this is 3 groups of 1, and this is 2 groups of thirds. So that's why this is equivalent to 3, because this just literally means 3 groups of 1 whole. again, that's important to make that distinction over and over again. This is a good place to talk to your child about the commutative property of multiplication, meaning you can switch the factors and you end up getting the same product. However, you could try and teach your child to think about this bar model because it's a useful way of seeing numbers and number lines for the future. So 3 times 2/3 is equivalent to 2/3 times 3. But multiplication oftentimes is thought of as groups of. So this says 2/3 of 3. Well, here's 3 whole units, right? This is 3 altogether. The way this works is if you're trying to find 2/3 of 3, then I got to break up all these into thirds. So I have 3/3, 3/3, and 3/3. So that's 9 total thirds, which is equivalent to 3. So I'm just going to write that down here, see if this works. So 2/3 of the entire group. Well, let's see. It might be easier to think about 2/3 of every one. So if I make this into 2/3 of that one, 2/3 of that one, and 2/3 of that one whole, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's 6/3. Now remember, I just thought about 3 is equal to 9/3, so now I'm checking. Is 2/3 times 9/3 equal to the same thing as 6/3? Well, 2 times 9 is 18, 3 times 3 is 9, 18 divided by 9 is 2, 6 divided by 3 is also 2, equivalent answers. But here's one more way you might want to talk to your child about thinking about fractions of a whole number. If I'm looking for 2/3 of 3, I can see 3 here. I can break it up into the denominator, p size, which is thirds. And if I take 3 and divide up into 3 equal parts, it's 1, 1, and 1. But 2/3, each of these is 1/3. Hope that makes sense. So this is 1/3, this is 1/3. So the sum is 2. And 2 is 2/3 of 3. That's another way to get your kid thinking about whole numbers times fractions. It's a very useful way to think about it. So this last one says 2/3 times 5, or 2/3 of 5. Well, your child should recognize that the answer should be less than 5 for the reasons explained before. And this is repeated addition, 2/3 plus itself 5 times. So again, that pattern of, well, that's just 2 5 times, which is 2 times 5, which is 10. And then we can picture in our minds that there are groups of thirds. So it's 10 thirds. But just to solidify, 5 can be rewritten as 5 over 1. Remember, because that means 5 groups of 1 whole. This is 2 groups of thirds. So the answer is 10 thirds. And so we'll discuss this in our division lessons, but this is a fraction. It's also read as a division problem. This says 10 divided by 3. So how many groups of 3/3 can we make? Well, I know that 3 times 3 is 9, and then there's 1 left over. So this is the same thing as 3 groups of 3/3 plus 1/3. So 10 thirds is equivalent to 3 and 1/3. Now in the next segment in this series, we'll talk about multiplying a fraction times a fraction and how to make sense of the answer. But once you have the algorithm down, it's really pretty straightforward. It just becomes more about understanding if the answer makes sense or not. Because when you combine this with doing division, then kids get all mixed up if they can't really understand what they're thinking about and what they're doing. So until next time, have a great evening.